Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Happily Ever After podcast. I'm your host, Shabir Hassan, founder of the Nikah Company. This is a podcast, of course, which is dedicated to everything related to marriage and relationships in Islam. Today, we've got a very, very special guest, someone that I've studied with, graduated with, taught with, traveled with, you name it. We've pretty much been there together over the years, alhamdulillah. And one of the projects, in fact, that we've worked on, that we started together and that we're continuing to work on is something, it's an institute by the name of Q Iman, where our guest is he's the founder of, he's the dean at as well. It's an institute based in the heart of East London, where we teach adults the Arabic language and the Islamic sciences. So we have with us today Ustadh Abu Zuhair. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, Shaykh.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah.
How are you doing? You okay?
I'm good, alhamdulillah.
Alhamdulillah.
Yes.
Thank you for joining us. We've got some interesting discussions coming up today. As you can see from the title, intentionally I've put it that way, which is culture versus Islam. Intentionally I've done it that way because, of course, for a lot of people, they would probably assume that Islam is perhaps at odds with culture. So it seems to be like either you're on one side or the other, right? So, inshallah, a lot of our discussion today for our listeners is basically going to be on it's going to be on culture and the role that culture may play for us as Muslims, especially in the context of marriage, where you would know when you're in that stage when you're preparing to get married, you would find there's perhaps a lot of things that may sound odd to you at times. Perhaps they're quite normal to you, and other things you may be a bit confused. Is this an Islamic practice? Is this a cultural practice? Am I allowed to do it? Am I not? So we're going to go from the very basics and talk about what culture actually means and the definitions of it and so on. Let's start from the very beginning then. Ustadh Abu Zuhair, I guess one of the main reasons why I wanted to tackle this in the podcast today is because from my experience, from what I found, there seems to be like two extremes in this, right? Usually. Either you would have a Muslim who basically puts culture even before Islam, like gives culture precedence even before their own religious beliefs and practices, right? So that's like one extreme. And then the other extreme is someone who thinks, well, actually, forget culture. It's all about following Quran, Sunnah, Islam, the Deen. Culture has no place whatsoever, and let's completely discard it. It's completely wrong to follow that. So this is from my experience, the two extremes that I've come across. What are your thoughts on that, and what can you tell us about what the term perhaps is that's normally used for culture or custom in Islam, and we can go from there, inshallah.
Okay, so first and foremost, alhamdulillah rabbil alameen wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulil kareem wa ala alihi wa sahbihi ajma'in. So thank you for calling me here. Me and Ustadh Shabir go long way back, right? So almost a decade together, teaching together, studying together. So anything I say, I'm pretty sure Ustadh Shabir can say. So we've had pretty much the same teachers and whatnot. Going on to the topic, I think this is a really, really important topic. And I don't know if you remember, but it was one of those fiqh lessons where our fiqh teacher, Maulana Ashraf, Hafidhullah, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve him and bless him, he brought this article in once. And the article, I can't quite remember who the author was at the time. And that was my first, I'm not sure about you, but that was my first insight into this whole discussion. Is culture part of Islam? Does Islam give us a culture that we have to follow? So if I'm wearing this thobe, is this an Islamic garb? I mean, people who aren't Muslim, they may think that, okay, this is the Islamic dress, the thobe, the hat, or, if you look at someone from Pakistan, the shalwara and qamis, right? That's the Islamic garb. Or maybe even the unsewn loin cloth, aka lungi. That's an Islamic garb. I mean, if you go to Indonesia, for example, they have some fantastic ones, right? Or Malaysia, very nice, nicely done, decked out ones, subhanAllah. So, I mean,
don't forget Bangladesh, yeah.
yeah, of course, and Bangladesh as well, of course. In fact, I think the first lungi I was gifted, no, actually, it was from a friend from Madras, South India.
Mm,
It's a big culture there as well. Pakistan
nice.
is I think it depends where you come from, but I can't speak for Pakistan because I don't know much about Pakistan, although my background is,
Yeah.
British Pakistani in that sense. Um, but nonetheless, when non-Muslims see Muslims, they have a perception of what a Islamic garment is. The question is, does Islam give us a garment?
Mm,
Does Islam say that this is how you have to dress or not? Or what about food? You know, does Islam say that we have to eat certain types of food? Does Islam say we can't eat other types of food? What about the way we speak, the language we use? What about the knowledge that we gain? Does Islam restrict us with regards to what types of knowledge we can delve into? Does Islam tell us how to behave with each other socially? How do we conduct our business transactions? Funnily enough, all of these things are discussed in Islam. Islam does indeed give us guidelines. But what Islam doesn't do is give us specifics. And that's the key point here.
mm,
If you look at, well, what is Sharia? I'll just give a very quick definition of Sharia. Often in the books of Usul, they say Sharia is the overarching framework under which you have fiqh, you have matters of aqaid. So you have legal jurisprudence, or which would eventually be, translated into legislation or common law in comparison to what we have today in the English legal system. But also aqaid, matters pertaining to your basic tenets of faith and all other aspects of Sharia.
mm.
And then you have the discussion of fiqh. So what is fiqh? This is the question. Now, the earliest person, one of the earliest definitions we have is Imam Abu Hanifa. And he said, Ma'rifatun nafs ma laha wa ma alayha. It's knowing your rights and duties. And then when you look at Imam Shafi'i's definition, he gives a more in-depth definition. He says, look, it's to do with the actions of the person. Those actions which Sharia requires of him or her to do or not to do. And the evidences for that is derived from legal sources such as Quran and Sunnah, Ijma', Qiyas, and what have you.
Mm.
Now, those are just definitions. But when you get into the thick of it, what actually is Sharia though?
Yeah.
And you begin to hear this term often in the Quran, hududullah. Essentially, the Quran and the Sharia is a circle, right? Imagine it like a circle. This is the boundary. You can do what you like within that boundary. What you can't do is transgress that boundary. If you
Mm.
transgress that boundary, then you are sinful. And if it's a matter of aqidah, then you are either out of the fold of the Ahlul Sunnah wal Jama'ah, Sunni Islam, or you are out of the fold of Islam entirely. So the idea is to operate within that boundary, but you can do what you like in that boundary. So I'll give you some basic examples, then we'll go to the actual definition of urf.
Yeah.
When it comes to the Islamic garb, does Islam tell us we have to wear this, meaning the thobe or the hat? No, it doesn't. Islam says the aura of the man is from the navel to the knee. Whether the knees are included or the navel is included, this is a discussion of ikhtilaf between fuqaha. I don't want to get into that. But generally speaking, the navel to the knee. The aura of the woman is the whole body except her hands and her face. If you're Hanafi, then except the feet. Even in
Yeah.
Hanafi madhab, there is some ikhtilaf there. Now, how you cover that, that's up to you. Whether you go to an Islamic shop behind East London Mosque, right, and you buy a jilbab from there, or you buy a thobe from there, or you go to any other shop, and you buy a garment that fulfills those conditions of the aura, or you take your curtain off or your bedsheet and you wrap it around yourself, the hudud of Allah have been maintained. There's no strict requirement that this is what you have to wear.
Mm.
Islam tells us this is the hudud, don't cross it. You have to cover your aura. How you cover it is up to you. Of course, there are other conditions as well that, your figure, it can't be so tight that your figure is showing. It can't be like vulgar. It can't be see-through. You shouldn't wear.
Modesty, isn't it?
Yeah,
Modesty,
exactly,
haya.
exactly. And modesty is part of hijab, isn't it? So
Mm.
plus you shouldn't be wearing like t-shirts with say, you know, um, uh, obscene words or obscene pictures, those types of things. But Islam doesn't tell us what to wear. Now, let's move on to food, for example. Islam doesn't tell us necessarily that you have to eat chow mein, you have to eat biryani, you have to eat, paratha, right? Which is it's like how do I explain paratha? It's like a chapati, right? But with
basically
a lot of oil in it, or what we say, ghee in it. Yeah. So Islam doesn't tell us what to eat in that sense, how to eat. Islam tells us, look, when it comes to laham, when it comes to meat, then there are certain animals we can consume, certain animals we can't consume. And even there's ikhtilaf. Like, for example, the matters of the animals of the ocean. Can we eat anything in the ocean? Can we eat any aquatic animal? Or do we just have to eat fish? So there are discussions there, but what I'm saying is in food, there are some key things that we have to observe. We can only eat certain animals, and we can only eat them in so long as they have been slaughtered. Of course, not sea animals, but land animals, they have to be slaughtered. Sea animals, like fish, you can consume them without being slaughtered. Now, how you cook them, who decides that? Or what you wear, who decides that? That's your urf, that's your culture that decides that. Take language. Now, whether Arabic is fard to learn or not is a separate discussion. If Arabic is fard to learn, then what does that mean? Now, everybody will agree, every Muslim should endeavor to learn enough Arabic to be able to pray their Salah, which means what? Surah Al-Fatiha and a few chapters from the Quran that will allow them to pray the Salah, learn certain du'as, learn how to do thana, learn how to do tahiyyah, learn how to send salawat and salam on the Prophet ﷺ, and of course we encourage them to learn more as much as they can. Then comes, well, is it fard for me to learn to memorize the Quran? That's another discussion. And to actually substantiate that would be very difficult, because even the Sahaba didn't memorize the Quran. Okay, fine. What about learning the language in order to understand Arabic? There's ikhtilaf. Some ulama have believed, yes, it is fard. Others say, look, only so much so you can begin to appreciate the surah in the Quran, and that you can have khushu and khudu in salah. Some people don't even have the intellectual ability to learn the Arabic language. What about our older parents who never had the opportunity to learn? Can we make it fard upon them? This is a separate discussion. However, even Arabic differs country to country. What language they use, what words they use. One example, I remember one of our teachers, Sheikh Spini, Muhammad Spini, he mentioned not long ago in one of the classes we were doing with Sheikh Spini on Shafi'i fiqh, that he's Syrian, right? So in Syria, when you say the word hut, what does hut mean? It means fish. It means whale.
Whale, yeah.
Specifically means the whale, right? But you go to Morocco, everything is hut. Every fish in the sea is hut. So when a Moroccan goes up to a Syrian and says, look, come to my house, I'll give you some hut, the Syrian gets really excited. Oh my God, you got whale? Where'd you get the whale? Where did you hunt the whale from? So these are matters of culture. Which words to use, how the words are used, the language in which you speak, the body language. It's all cultural. Certain things in certain cultures are known to be disrespectful. The way you speak, the way you interact with each other, the social interactions are contingent on culture. And we'll go through some examples, but even when it comes to mahar, if the mahar is stipulated, right, then that person should get that mahar. But if in certain conditions, if there's a talaq or the husband dies, then the woman is entitled to what we call mahar mithl. What is mahar mithl? Mahar mithl is what we call customary dowry. The dowry and the amount of that dowry is considered to be the same amount that other females in that bride's family have received. What's that based on? It's based on the urf. It's based on the culture. So kind of reeling back from all of these intricate examples, what we understand is Islam gives us guidelines. Islam gives us principles or usul. The furu', when we take these principles, and apply those principles, the subsidiary matters in the periphery, they are contingent on our culture. And I won't stop there. I'll mention one more thing. When it comes to culture culture is actually very important, and it always has been very important. When you, if you remember when we were studying hadith, and I remember on many occasions we came across this idea of adala. In order to ascertain whether a hadith is sahih or not, one of the conditions is to see whether the narrator who's delivering that hadith is adl, right? Or adil, sifa mushabba, you can use both. Meaning, is this person an upright person? Now, generally speaking, how do you ascertain whether someone's upright or not? Do they have the right to bear testimony in the court of law? If they lose that right, because let's say they accuse someone falsely and they were caught out to have lied in a court of law, then they lose the right to bear testimony in the court of law. But on a much lower level, ulama were also looking at, does this person actually adhere to the urf or not? Does he wear a hat? Does he publicly spit? These are all cultural, right? So it had these things to a minor degree, but nonetheless they were important to the muhaddithin, and they had an impact on how a hadith scholar perceived a particular narrator. Culture. Also, in the this whole thing about in the Hanafi madhab, am I allowed to pray salah whilst exposing my elbows? Generally speaking, the Hanafis, they rely on, Allahu Jamil wa yuhibbul Jamal. Allah is beautiful and He loves beauty. So, if you roll up your sleeves, right, as I often do sometimes, you have to get a lot of work done. If you roll up your sleeves above your elbows and you pray, it's not that your prayer is, invalid. It's not heavily disliked, but, fix yourself up. Look the part when you stand before your Lord and you pray to Him. But go to Morocco, and what is the urf? What is the culture of the people?
Yeah, it's the norm, isn't it?
Yeah, so they wear those sort of half-sleeve thobes, right? And the elbow is exposed, and that's their culture, and it's a beautiful garment to them. So how does that apply there? So on the subsidiary and periphery level, urf or culture has a role to play.
Yeah,
So
interesting.
I was
just gonna quickly say on the point of, because you mentioned at the beginning, you mentioned this whole thing about hudud, right? Within the Sharia, we have this hudud, which is mentioned a lot of times in the Quran. Whoever goes beyond, whoever transgresses beyond the hudud, the limits that have been placed by Allah. But I think this ties in with our discussion now as well. Now that we're going to link it into marriage, is a lot of people, they think that the hudud, these boundaries, they are actually very restrictive in nature, if that makes sense. They think that, okay, yeah, I get it, there's a boundary, but actually there's not much I can do within that space. I think this is where what I mentioned at the beginning of the first extreme, the second extreme of those who basically want nothing to do with culture, is where they tend to think, you know what, this, I'm only allowed to do X, Y, Z as a Muslim, and that is the boundary, and nothing more than that. Obviously, you've already explained, right, what role culture can play. But I think just mentioning the point that the hudud actually is not as restrictive as you think it is. Actually, there's a lot of movement within that. There's a lot of flexibility within that. But I think that is where we need to clarify now some of the more specifics, isn't it? Within, through examples and so on. So yeah. So sorry, you were saying.
Yeah, no, just to that's a really good point you made. Just to add on that point, something that I came across in my research was this idea that, this notion that these hudud create restriction. That may well be the case, right? You can't expect to live a life of no laws and no rules and regulations. The opposite of that is absolute utter anarchy. Even in a secular, non-Islamic society, you have laws. If you take English legal system, it is not contingent, but it is a product of Christendom, right? This is one of the first things you study when you study jurisprudence. And it is heavily inspired by Christianity, although it has moved on, it has changed a lot, but there are still laws, right? If we didn't have laws, people would decide to do what they want. The question is, what's the difference between laws in a secular country and laws in Sharia? Laws in secular country are, for the most part, at least in modern times, are things that have come from man's own, entirely separately, man's own intellect. The Shari'i laws are not from man's intellect. They are through divine inspiration, through wahi and ilham that were given to the Prophet ﷺ, and he then in turn taught it, and it has been delivered to us through a sahih chain of narration from the utmost upright people. Now, who better to tell us what are the laws? The person who is confined in a specific era and a specific bubble of time, or the one who created time, the one who has access to, who sees the past, the present, and the future. When he gives you a principle that is more universal than any principle we stuck in our bubble can come to.
Absolutely.
And I think that's an important point to mention. So yes, of course, rules are there. Rules do restrict you, but to what extent is the question? And I think what's happened is over time, when the fuqaha wrote their books, like when you read Quduri or when you read Matan Abi Shuja', the more the Shafi'i text, or you read Khiraqi, which is more humbly narrated, or you read the Mudawwana from the Maliki Madhab, whichever book you read, right, or whichever Matan core text that you read, you'll begin to realize a lot of the subsidiary masail, fiqhi matters, juristic matters, many of the subsidiary and periphery matters are based on their customs. And what's happened is that those customs are now considered to be a big part of what is Sharia, when actually they're not Sharia. But what they do is help us to understand how to apply the Sharia to our time. I'll mention something very small, a little bit controversial, but something small, something that I've been working on, is this small idea. Should Muslims in the West build mosques with domes and minarets? This is a question. This is a question that we have to research. Now, so a lot of people will get very offended. Oh my God, how can you say we can't have minarets and domes? And, I'm pretty sure, I think, in Sweden or one of these countries, there is this discussion of getting rid of the minarets. Yeah. Now, we know that adhan, al-adhanu sha'ira min sha'airillah, that adhan is a hallmark from the hallmarks of Islam, if you will, right? So it's very important to us. But did the Prophet's mosque have a minaret in the Prophet's time? Did the Prophet's mosque have a green dome in the Prophet's time? And you'll find very quickly that it didn't. The Haram didn't. You have minarets, and mosques were later developments. And the reason why we have minarets, or the Muslim Ummah developed minarets, was so that the sound can go out, into the community and people can hear the adhan. And the reason why the dome was invented was because the dome can amplify that sound. And yes, they are inventions. In other words, they are a bid'ah, right?
But of course, by linguistic definition.
Yeah, linguistically speaking, they are a bid'ah. But of course, that bid'ah is not a bid'ah shari'iyah. If it was a bid'ah shari'iyah, then this is impermissible, right? So we see good in those inventions. I mean, I think it was in Indonesia, they used to use drums, right?
Really?
So yeah, there would be a person who would give adhan, but the sound of the adhan would not penetrate through the thickness of the forests. So they used to use drums to let people know, oh look, adhan is going off. And people throughout the ages have used different techniques to help people understand that. Now, when we come to the UK and we come to our zamana, our era, we have technology now. We have speakers, we have mics. We make use of that. We make use of that because it helps us to inform people. What is the function? What is the maqsad of adhan? I'lam or i'lan, both correct. To announce that it is the waqt of prayer. So if we can achieve that without the minaret or the dome, then it's not haram to not have a minaret or dome. And frankly speaking, why aren't our mosques more, why don't they look the part, or why aren't they part of our architectural culture that we have in the West? If they were, they wouldn't look very different, and they would be part of the overall community structure.
just
Now,
become very symbolic today, hasn't it? It's just you look
it
throughout
has.
the Muslim world, isn't it? And I think we today, especially, we always want to hold on as much as we can to our tradition, which is not a bad thing. I'm not saying it's a bad thing. I'm saying
Mm,
I think nowadays in the West, we just want to hold on as much as we can to that. To that, perhaps maybe it's like an identity thing as well. Like, if you're not
mm,
wearing a hat, if you're not doing such and such thing, then it's like Islam is slipping away from us. You know what I mean? So I think, yeah,
yeah.
I mean, just to perhaps add that maybe I think some of it is actually good. I reckon as well. I think it's definitely a lot of it is
No,
good,
no,
positive
absolutely. I
to
mean,
hold on
yeah.
to certain things, isn't it? And likewise, I think your question is very valid, though. I think it's a very valid
Mm,
question. If we're doing the job with everything else, why are we still? I think one of our teachers actually, just since you mentioned it, I know it's not, got nothing related to the marriage bit, but it's interesting that even one of our teachers did actually say that, you know what, perhaps because now we're erecting these minarets and donning these domes on masajid around the UK, is there a link between this and right-wing attacks, Islamophobic attacks? This may rile people up
mm,
even more. Why is there why is there an Islamic symbol in my country for? Of
mm,
course we
mm.
don't we don't agree with what they're saying,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there is a valid point here. If it is going to rile people up, and if you can just have a mosque that does the job of being a mosque, you know what I mean, not spending millions of pounds just to make it look nice and nothing's happening inside. You can actually get the job done, which is masjid, meaning a place of worship, and get the worship done, then it really is there a need to, basically spend more attention and so on. So I think, yeah, it's definitely a valid point.
Yeah, I mean, look, just to sort of like I said, I'm not advocating for us getting rid of domes and mosques. I
Yeah,
think
yeah.
there's a certain beauty to it, and just
Mm,
to add to that, Islam is a lot of things that ulama did, a lot of things that the previous Muslims did. They did
mm,
it because they had a more spiritual connection with Islam and they
yeah,
understood the nature of beauty, right? Like if you go to Mauritania, you go to, even if you go back to Pakistan and Bangladesh, you'll notice that people, they tend to adorn the most simplistic of things, like pens and books. They'll put covers on their books, they'll put
mm,
little wraparounds on their pens because just the standard big pen is pretty ugly. And we are living in a zamana where a lot of the things are beauty is being stripped from it. And mosques are places, should be a place of awe as well. When you walk into a mosque in Turkey, it puts you in awe because of the
yeah,
grandeur of that mosque. So I completely understand that. But what I'm saying is ultimately, it is not a matter of fard or sunnah
mm,
or haram here, right? Because urf, the domes and the minarets were an urf. It was
mm,
part of our urf. We understood that customarily or culturally speaking, technologically we needed them to amplify
yeah,
the sound and to send the sound out. But then we adorned our mosques. What was that
mm,
based on? The art of the mosques, the mosaics and the calligraphy. What was that based on? It was based on
mm,
culture. I mean, even in calligraphy, you have different styles. You have the
yeah,
Diwani style, for example, right? It differs from the Kufi style, right? Depending on where you come from, there were differences in that. And
yeah.
for the, we do have mosques in the UK that don't have domes and minarets. We have
Oh yeah, of
multiple
course.
Islamic centers and what have you. But what I'm saying is, the point that I'm trying to make is culture culture has in the past had a big role in
Mm,
how our Islam manifests to the observer at a distance.
yeah.
And it's okay. It's okay to have a different culture. It's not
Mm.
haram.
I'm going to
Yeah.
quickly come in on the term that you're using in Arabic is urf, right?
Yep.
Which is used widely even in many of the classical texts by a
Yep.
lot of our scholars, right? They've used this
Yep.
word. In fact, forget classical texts, the Quran itself, right? You will
Mm.
actually find this word in the Quran, the word urf. It's quite interesting the fact that being teachers of the Arabic language, our interest lie in Arabic language a lot. It comes from arafa, which actually means to recognize something, right?
Yeah.
The
Yeah.
the word itself means to actually recognize something, and throughout the Quran, Surah Al-Baqarah, in marriage, in fact, when Allah speaks about mahar and so on in the Quran, he says mata'an bil ma'ruf. The word
Yeah.
ma'ruf comes from urf, right? And in Surah Al-Hujurat, I believe, where Allah says lita'arafu, right? So that you can recognize, get to know each other. And this is just after he's mentioned the fact that he's placed us into different tribes and nations, right? Isn't it? So that you can recognize. So because why? Naturally, what's going to happen is we're gonna be we may look different to each other. We may speak different languages. We may, practice the same thing but in a different way and eat different foods, like you said, right? But it all comes down to urf, recognizing that there is some sort of difference. So in fact, the Quran, we're not even saying that, urf has a place in Islam. We're actually saying that the Quran fully acknowledges urf, fully acknowledges the customs of people. And if you want to go from the Quran to the Sunnah, or you look at the life of the Prophet ﷺ, are we going to say that yes, he lived in Arab society, but he was not an Arab? He did not want anything to do with the practices of the Arabs. He divorced himself entirely from that. In fact, complete opposite. You study the Sirah at a very basic level, right? You would know that the Prophet ﷺ, he was actually very proud to be an Arab, but not in terms of asabiya and this nationalistic kind of extremist kind of view on things. No, but he was proud that, I'm from a blessed land. I'm from Mecca. This is the land of the Haram. I moved to Medina. That's a blessed city. I rename it, even forget Yathrib. Let's call it, Medinatul Nabi, Medinatul Rasul. And the way that he was dressing, the food that, we were teaching Shama'il recently. We covered the types of food that he loved. Tharid, he has mentioned tharid, this kind of dish, right, where it has some pieces of meat and so on. This is an Arab dish, right? So he loved and he appreciated, and even the clothes that he wore and etc. That all was him following or showing his appreciation for his culture and custom. So I wanted to just touch on the word urf and just some basics. If you want to share some basics about it, like what's the definition generally speaking, and then how can we kind of tie that in with our understanding today?
So what I'm going to do is I've actually I thought what I'd do for this session is just look at the usul books and get a very basic definition, yet informative one. So if you go to any usul book, most of the definitions tend to be quite similar. There might be some differences, but someone like Sheikh Abdul Wahab Khalaf, he mentions in his book Ilm Usul Fiqh the definition of urf, and I've got an interpretive rendition of it here, and I'll just read it out. It's very short. I'll read it out, and just to show you how the usuliyun, the legal theorists see urf. So he says custom or urf is an acquainted manner in which people of a specific land, nation, area, or tribe interact with one another in the way they speak to each other, the manner in which they behave with one another, the way they dress, the food they eat, the manner in which they socially and transactionally interact with one another, the manifestation of their architecture, technology, and innovations, which are often linked to the topographical or geographical requirements. Often the word urf is interchangeably used with the word adda, which is commonly translated as habit. So you can see because you gave a very nice linguistic definition, and this is what we call the more technical definition, the istilahi definition or the shari'i definition of the word urf. And you can see here that urf relates to how we behave with each other, how we interact with each other, and it's usually confined by a specific land or a specific area. And it's also how we express ourselves and how our sort of culture manifests with people. And it also applies to your architecture and your technological development. A lot of that is based on the urf of the people. Now, when it comes to the deeper details, there is two types of urf. There's what we call urf sahih and urf fasid. Okay, so urf sahih is that urf, that aspect of culture which does not infringe any of the rules of Sharia. If something infringes the rule of Sharia, this is unacceptable. For example, if there is what we call a usurious transaction, with a transaction in which there is riba or gambling, just because gambling is part of someone's culture doesn't mean it becomes permissible. Just because the consumption of alcohol is part of someone's culture does not mean it's acceptable. When the first Muslims from the Indus River tribes, which is modern day India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, when the first Muslims from those tribes, or the first people to become Muslims from those tribes became Muslim, if they carried on certain practices from Hinduism, such as directly worshipping the graves, not that that's what everybody's doing. We know that there are some unfortunate innovations that do happen amongst these cultures, but let's say someone is directly worshipping the grave because this is a practice in a Hindu culture, this will be completely unacceptable. So any custom or cultural practice that directly infringes a hukum of the Sharia, a ruling of the religion of Islam, then we have to reject it. But other things, for example, uqud al-istisna, right, which is manufacturing contracts. In Islamic finance, you learn that, what is an Islamic contract and Islamic transactions. You learn that in order for you to sell or purchase something, the seller must be in possession of that item. That item must be in existence, and that item must be in his possession, his or her possession. So if I want to sell you my phone, it should be in existence, and it should be my phone. I can't imagine my brother comes home and I say to my brother, Umair, I've sold your phone to Ustadh Shabir. What? You didn't have the right to sell my phone. Or if I say to you, I'll sell you an iPhone, but it hasn't come into existence. Now, how does that relate to manufacturing contracts? If I go to a person, a carpenter, who's going to build me a door for a mosque, for example, the door does not exist. Yeah? Now, if the door does not exist, the question is, can I pay him for that transaction? It may be the case he needs the money to buy the materials, to build the door, and then deliver it to me. What do I do? Now, the ultimate maqsad, right? One of the great purposes of Islamic finance is what? Is to reduce the probability of dispute. All right? Now, if customarily, culturally speaking, this is a norm that in order for you to purchase a piece of furniture or a door or a staircase from a carpenter, you have to pay him first. He'll make it and then deliver it. If that is a norm, then the probability of dispute is very low. This is acceptable. And almost most fiqh books mention uqud al-istisna, right? I'll give you another example. Relating more to Nikah Co and the service that you guys provide, does mahar need to be given mu'ajjalan, right, or mu'ajjalan? Mu'ajjal from ta'jil, does it have to be given immediately at the time of the contract of nikah, before the bride has gone into or has joined the bridegroom and they've become husband and wife? Or can the mahar be delayed? Who decides? This is often based on urf. In certain cultures, mahar is delayed. In certain cultures, mahar is not delayed. So long as it's executed, so long as there is the transference of mahar, Sharia doesn't necessarily force us to pay it immediately, although there are hadith that you should pay something. The Prophet ﷺ said that, when a man marries a woman, let him give something before he consummates the marriage. Otherwise, it's like zina. Not that it is zina. It's like zina, meaning that there is huge encouragement to either give the mahar before or give a portion of it before, which is, a lot of the fuqaha say that you should give something before, and then later on you can give the mahar. But what is that based on? That's based on the culture of the people. I'll give another one that we have is this concept of, in Urdu we say ruksati. Now ruksati is basically when you give the bride away, when the family gives the bride away to the bridegroom. Now that process is based on urf, right? Some people might do it immediately, some people might do it a couple of days later. How that happens, the sort of festivities around that is based on culture. We know that the Prophet ﷺ married Aisha, and later on she went to live with him. She didn't live with him at the time of the contract. It was when she was a bit older, she went to live with the Prophet ﷺ. So these are all examples of urf sahih.
This is
because
it's
they're
a very
not.
common thing nowadays, by the way. I'm sure a lot of people listening have a lot of questions on this.
Yeah.
And we're talking about even here in the West. Let's talk about the UK. Definitely in the West, like it's a very common thing, especially within the South Asian culture. You know,
Mm,
Indians, Bangladesh, Pakistanis, even Afghanis, etc. They have this, right? They have this
yeah.
thing where, you know, let's get nikah is on a particular. Let's say it's in December 2020, but the rukhsati or the main walima, the big do, where the bride officially will basically leave her parents' home, move in with the guy, etc. That will be done in, example, April 2021, right? So
Mm,
now with
mm,
5 month gap here, they call it a gap. So let me tell you, there's a lot of there's huge misunderstandings here. Firstly, so some people they say they're on one extreme, yeah, where they're
mm,
like completely against this. No, this is wrong. You know why? Because you know anything can happen in that time. You know, anything things can go wrong in that time. It's not good, etc. I get where they're coming from, but at the end of the day, if the nikah was done, then they're married. Do you know what I mean? Like if things go wrong, that's just how any couple has to deal with it, whether they're living together or not. Do you see what I mean? Like if something goes wrong, if there's a problem, you as a married couple, that's down to you to resolve it. That in the correct manner. So I don't get this whole thing about things can go wrong or whatever. I understand culturally again, and I think also from the perspective of the young people now looking to get married in this country or wherever in the West, I think they also have to be understanding. And this is something I did want to speak
mm.
about as well, where it's not just now, well, it's not haram though, is it? You know, we use this card now, this religious card. Oh, it's not haram though. So where did you show me where it says I'm not allowed to do it? And then I think a lot of disrespect now is shown to the elders who perhaps from where they're coming from, this is actually a big thing. And it is, how they were raised and from their particular culture, wherever it may be. Now we kind of like aren't understanding of that. So again, there's extremes in this, right? Where either you're like completely disrespecting it and not understanding that, you know what, this is someone else's culture and I got to respect and I got to understand that and I got to meet them halfway, or
Mm,
like we said, completely discarding it. So it's an interesting example that you've mentioned. Even since we're on the topic, I'll just ask because it was actually one of the examples I was going to present as well. So I've got a few examples in my head right now that I was going to like, without kind of giving you a heads up on it, I was just going to mention it and see where it goes with this whole oath discussion. Like, would we consider? We're not giving like a fatwa here and saying yes,
mm.
absolutely blanket. But from our experience, from what we kind of have learned, like is this a sahih thing? Is it a fasid one? Is it a good urf? Is it a bad urf? So I have a few examples in mind, right? So is it okay if we just go through some of those
Sure.
now? Yeah. Okay,
Absolutely.
cool. So since we're on the whole rukhsati discussion, let's talk about Mehndi parties. Okay. So as you know, again, it's very common that
Mm,
before the nikah, this isn't, by the way, the Mehndi is never really a collective thing. It's not to do with the bride and groom. Yeah, the
mm,
bride does
mm.
her own thing, the groom does. So it's not, there's no issues there. But it's the idea of actually doing this party, whatever you
Yeah.
want to call it,
Yeah.
celebration, whatever. Yeah. So now, what happens in the Mehndi itself? I don't want to talk about that because people will celebrate it their own ways. Yeah. So of
Mm,
course, depending on what you do, that could change the whole dynamics of this discussion. Let's just talk about
mm,
the actual idea of a Mehndi.
mm,
Now, on one hand, you could argue, well, I'm having a get together with my family members, right? Um, we're gonna obviously celebrate. This is like one of our last opportunities to get together and have a good time, whatever. And whether there's a lot of the times today, it's called a Mehndi. Basically, for those of you that don't know what Mehndi is, henna, right? It's called a Mehndi, but actually sometimes people don't even put it on. It's just culturally called a Mehndi, right? It's just a pre-wedding kind of thing. But then someone could argue, actually, hold on a second, this whole idea of a Mehndi, doesn't it stem from like some kind of Hindu tradition, like going way back, where in India they would perhaps do this, and this was part of their religious ceremony, perhaps. Maybe there's some link you can find where they actually used to put on a dress and apply henna to the bride and whatever they do their own celebration. So actually, this is this is a really bad practice. You're not allowed to do Mehndi. So using this example today now in our context, where nothing to do with Hinduism, etc., etc., it's just by name. What are your thoughts on that, tying it in with our discussion right now on Urf?
No, I think it's a really, really good point. When it comes to the issue of Mehndi, right?
Mm.
Whether or not it was tied to Hinduism as a religious practice, right? First and foremost, we will have to prove that that is the case. Assuming that is the case,
Yeah.
is that why people celebrate Mehndi today? Is it the deification of a god other than Allah? Na'udhu billah. Is it a irreligious practice? Is it a practice of a complete different religion, or is it a practice of that particular region? Now, the mushrikeen from amongst the Arab, right, before Islam and after Islam, used to conjure up poetry in certain patterns, right? This was a practice. And they used poetry to further their irreligious, well, I say irreligious, but their shirk, right? And their agendas. Did the Prophet ﷺ come and ban the usage of poetry? On the contrary, he asked some of the Sahaba to go on the pulpit and compose poetry to defend Islam. When the Prophet ﷺ, bearing in mind, he is Bashira wa Nadhira, he's the bearer of glad tidings and the warner. He's duty bound to point out something which is haram. If he doesn't, that's called taqrir, tacit approval from an usuli perspective, which means it's acceptable.
Yeah.
So when the Prophet ﷺ did hijrah with Abu Bakr and they came to Medina, everybody was so eager to see the Prophet. Even a Yahudi, even a Jew came and he saw the Prophet. He came running back. He said, "Look, oh Muslims, your Prophet is here." Even he was eager to see who is this man that everybody talks about. And when the Prophet ﷺ came, all of the children gathered. They had the daf, which is the sort of the drum, one-sided drum, and they were singing "Tala al-Badru alayna." Right? The Prophet didn't turn around and say, "Why are you doing this?" Where did they get this practice from? Is there a hadith? Did the Prophet send a messenger before he did hijrah, give them hadith that yes, you can do this practice? It was part of their culture. They would celebrate certain things. And the Prophet, not only did he tolerate it, he was happy that they did it. It was a joyous occasion to welcome them. Now, if they had done certain things for religious reasons, well, first and foremost, we'll have to prove it, like I said. And secondly, we have to ask the question, was it actually religious or was it more of the culture of the people? There's hadith where when Aisha radiallahu anha came to the Prophet ﷺ, and she mentioned that she had attended a wedding, and the Prophet said, "Did you guys dance? Did you have a good time?" He said, "Why didn't you guys have a good time? Why didn't you guys celebrate?" Right? Think of those African warriors that came to the masjid and they did a war dance. It's possible that centuries ago, many of these practices were not necessarily linked intrinsically to that faith, but was a practice of the people which will belong to a particular faith. But they carried these practices on because they were more to do with the practice of the land and the culture of the people than religious practices.
Yeah.
So they came and in the masjid of the Prophet, they did this war dance. And Aisha said, "I put my chin on the Prophet's shoulder, and he allowed me to peek into the masjid and see this war dance. And I stayed there for a long time, not because I enjoyed it. I wanted to see how long would the Prophet tolerate me." So we have multiple examples in which the Prophet ﷺ, he didn't have an issue with it. On the contrary, think of the matter of Ashura. When some of the narrations talk about how the Jews said, "We celebrate Ashura because this was the day that Musa alayhi salam saved Bani Israel from the clutches of Pharaoh." The Prophet said, "We're more deserving of Ashura." That was a practice from another faith, although it was a Sahih practice, right? Because Musa alayhi salam is our Prophet. We believe in him. Nonetheless, the point I'm trying to make is there are religious practices which are ceremonial, where there is a deification of a god other than God. And then there are cultural practices. If it's the case that a Mehndi is a cultural practice, no, it's not haram at all. And if the women want to get together, so long as there are no men there and they want to have a, celebrate, I see no problem in that at all. You have to bring me, the onus is on the person who rejects this, to bring me evidence to suggest that this is haram. Yes, religious practices which are intrinsically linked to the deification of another, right? This is haram. The other matter that comes is tashabbuh bil kuffar, we say.
Yeah.
Right? The resembling the disbelievers. And of
So
course, we
hold
know.
that thought, Ustadh, please, because
Yeah.
I'm going to read something out to you now. Okay.
Okay.
I haven't done this here, which is
All right.
I put a video not on this channel, complete separate on my personal one, a couple of right, on a complete separate topic on my YouTube channel. So anyway, I got a comment from it. So as you know, I always wear a wedding ring, right? You can see it right now. Like I always wear a wedding ring. That's my personal preference. I think you perhaps don't wear your wedding ring all the time. Whatever, right? It's up to a guy to decide if he wants to wear it or not. So here's a comment. I'm going to read it out right now. Yeah, I got this less than 24 hours ago. This individual, I don't know who they are, said, "This is the first time watching your video, so I do not know you. Can you tell me why you wear a wedding ring? Muslims do not wear wedding rings because it is following the traditions of non-Muslims. The wedding ring symbolizes marriage under the Trinity, which is shirk." So that was a comment that I got. And obviously my policy is I don't respond to comments. I don't debate and get involved in the comment section of things. I much prefer my student comes, a fellow colleague comes, wants to discuss, even if it's to criticize me, 100%. In person, we'll have a nice discussion, inshallah, in a respectful, dignified manner. So I'm not responding to this particular individual, but since you're now just coming on to tashabbuh bil kuffar, because essentially what this person is saying, that because I wear a wedding ring or we exchange wedding rings at our ceremonies, which we know, I'd be the first person to say that this isn't part of the nikah. This isn't from the deen, where the Prophet said, after the nikah, exchange rings. We know that's got nothing to do with the nikah Islam. I'll be the first to say that, fine. But because it's not from Islam per se, because the Prophet didn't, practice it or whatever, now does that make it something, okay, well, where does it come from? This whole idea, coming back to what we're talking about, is it a Western thing now? Is it a Christian thing, in fact? Does it have any link? Let's just say this person, let's say they have evidence that it was practiced, right? Where Christians did exchange rings and so on and so forth, right? What would we respond to that now that you're going into this whole discussion on imitation of the disbelievers?
This reminds me of the ring of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam.
Yeah.
Right. So the Sahaba actually came to the Prophet and they said, Ya Rasulullah, when the leaders of the kuffar, like the Roman leaders and the Persian leaders, when they send letters, they have a ring, a seal, and they push it into the wax, and then they seal that letter or ink or whatever what have you. So they said you should have one. So the Prophet had a ring made, right, which said Muhammad Rasulullah, and he had the word Allah written on top of it, right, at the top to show adab, and he used to wear that ring. There are hadith in regarding istinja, where before the Prophet ﷺ would go to relieve himself, he would remove that ring because he had Allah's name. And where did this practice come from? It was not a practice of Islam. Nor was it a practice of a particular religion. It may well be that you may be able to go into the past and dig up the internet and find that, the first people to use this practice were some Christian bishops. Right? First and foremost, the Prophet ﷺ didn't see that. Even if that may be the case. Okay, the Prophet didn't have information. So what? He made a mistake? Na'udhu billah, na'udhu billah. No, it's a culture. It was at that, regardless of what the history was, at that zamana, in that moment in time, it had nothing to do with any religious practice. It was a custom of how leaders dealt with each other. And he followed it. He had no issue with it. When he would address leaders, he would use the appropriate titles. He would say Kisra if he had to. Kisra is not the name, but he would say Kisra. The leaders of Persia. he had no problem addressing the Roman or the Persian leaders by the titles that were given to them, which may have religious connotations. He had no issue, especially the Orthodox Christians, right? For them, the head of state was also the head of the church, much like Protestant Christians today. So their titles, the Prophet didn't have an issue. That was their convention. And he respected their convention in doing so. Having said that, you'd be hard pressed to prove that wearing a ring today is symbolic of the Trinity. And I am a student of comparative religion. For the record, that's the first time I've even heard this. And secondly, what information are you relying on? Is there a Sahih Sanad? We have Sahih Asanid, right? We have every single narrator we judge that narrator, we critically evaluate that narrator, and then we take that information. Just Googling that information doesn't mean anything. Some Christian millions of years ago, no, I'm exaggerating that, but hundreds of years ago, wore a ring, and somehow that was symbolic of Trinity. To be honest, as the muhaddithin used to say, I can smell the fabrication from a distance. Wallahu a'lam if that's the case.
No, but even if it is the case, this is the thing, right? Even if you found something, right, to prove your point, the fact is, which Muslim today exchanges a ring after the wedding or as part of the nikah, after the nikah, believing that, what, I'm putting this ring on, because for this point, I'm a Christian and I follow that. I believe in the Trinity. Who does that? Or whoever thinks that this is a religious thing? I would struggle. I've conducted hundreds of nikah ceremonies, right? Which, by the way, one of them, there was actually a dispute over this issue on the day, where it's like I could already tell on the day that the parents of one of the sides it's almost like they were looking for something to pick on the day. So the thing that they found, they couldn't find anything. The thing that they found was, the other side said they want to give a ring. And this is not from the Sunnah, so we don't want to accept the ring. But what happened when they said that? That the bride became very upset. She was on the verge of tears, like she wants a ring, right? And the parent and the family are like, yeah, but this is not an Islamic thing, okay? So I had to explain to them in the nicest possible way, firstly, let's not even get into most of the stuff you probably did leading up to this wedding is all un-Islamic anyway, right? Let's just be real. Right, a lot of the stuff that you probably did in the lead up to it. Now you're picking something which actually there's nothing wrong with it. It's not a religious thing. It's a gift, if anything, right? And if anything, we're encouraged to give a nice gift for the wedding. Yeah, it's not part of the mahar, but it's a nice gift you give it, right, to mark the beginning of the marriage. My point is, coming back to culture, urf, right? Now, we cannot deny, as Muslims living in the West, that also we are part and parcel of the Western culture, quote unquote, right? Now, I know saying that a lot of Muslims are going to be like, they're going to be up on their seats right now thinking, what are you trying to say, that, we're westernized or something? Well, to some degree, yeah, you are. Like, you speak English, go learn Fusha Arabic then. You when you do istinja, you use water and all these things. Go use 3 rocks then, isn't it? 3 stones. You got what I mean? Like, you drive a car, you want to start riding a camel now. You know what I mean? Like, that's obviously my exaggerated comments there, but there's a lot of things that we're just generally doing, right, which is we're following even like coming back to what you mentioned about clothes and food. What are you going to say, that you're not allowed to eat fish and chips now? You know what I mean? Like, you're not allowed to wear a suit now, a nice blazer, because in the West you've seen it happen. So this is my point. So how do you want to add anything basically to this basically argument itself?
Yeah, so before I get to that, just one thing I'd mention regarding the ring. I mean, there's a hadith about this where the Prophet ﷺ said regarding, to a person who said, I don't have much mahar to give, even if it be a ring of iron, give it.
وَلَوْ خَاتَمْ مِنْ حَدِيدٍ.
There we go. Yeah. So there you go. You got even from that regard, it's not these things. You can give what you like, and yes, culturally speaking, in the West we will have certain practices, and it's nothing wrong with that. And for the record, giving a ring is not just a Western practice, right? It has been for many centuries it has been a subcontinent practice as well. The other thing I'll say is, look, much of the Western practices today are heavily inspired by the world around you, heavily inspired by countries like Singapore, countries like India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, because of the East India Trading Company. Much of the Western culture is, even like, if you look at the legal system, the 10-12 jury system in this country comes from Imam Malik's madhab. And it's very likely that through Muslim Spain, that Western nations learn Islamic legal theory and adopted that and integrated that in part of the system. You know, the graduation gowns you wear, where does it come from? In Qarawin and Azhar, they used to wear these. In Spain, in Granada, right, where Ibn Juzay is from. You know, the famous tafsir at-Tashil by Ibn Juzay, he's Granati, right? You go to these places, right? A lot of that culture comes from Muslims. The Muslims, when they graduated, they used to wear this gown and they used to wear this turban or this hat on top, which was then adopted by universities, and they're wearing it. So that's one thing to keep in mind. The second thing I'll say, touching on this concept of tashabbuh bil kuffar, right? Yeah. Often quoted, resembling the kuffar, the disbelievers. Now, the word tashabbuh, we're Arabic language students, we know that it is from form 5, as we say, yeah, babu tafa'ul, which any verb that comes from that pattern has what we call takalluf in it, hardship. And often, if you look at the commentaries regarding these ahadith, what do the ulama say? Adopting a practice which is religious, an intrinsic part of a religious ceremony, which is often to do with the deification of a god other than Allah, na'udhu billah, that is tashabbuh bil kuffar. Otherwise, if you're going to operate mutlaqan, generically, from a completely unqualified manner, if you're going to operate on the principle of tashabbuh bil kuffar, by God, you can't wear a t-shirt, you can't wear jeans, you can't use an iPhone, you can't use this stream, this is haram. We're not allowed to use any of this. So we have to be careful, but both ends. This does not mean that now we look at all, non-Islamic practices and we adopt them wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
Also, I do want to just touch on one small thing. This is a topic in and of itself, but I think the struggle that we are having today has to be discussed within the paradigm that we reside in. And the paradigm that we live in is very different from how the ulama were dealing with in the past, because no scholar ever envisaged a time would come that Muslims would be born in a completely non-Muslim land, a secular land, and they would be part and parcel of that nation, meaning, citizens.
Yeah.
And then you have to look at the nation state phenomenon, which is pretty much after, the fall of the Ottomans in 1924, right? The actualization of the nation state system. Before, you were defined by your tribes. What is a nation today? It's a collection of tribes. So you can be British in that sense, but belong to a specific tribe, which means that your Britishness is restricted to your tribe or your bubble. But many of us eat fish and chips, as you said. We eat fried chicken. These are not part of our culture from back home, but these are part of the culture that we reside in today. And essentially what we've stumbled into is our own culture. And within our bubbles, it's not identical to non-Muslims. That has to be understood as well. So look, this is a discussion in and of itself, and this will take a long time to explain, and like identity crisis and what have you. And maybe we can do a session on that as well one day. But in a nutshell, when it comes to adopting cultural practices, I'll just mention something very quickly, because Sheikh Abdul Wahab Khalaf says in his Kitab Ilm Usul Fiqh that urf sahih is actually obligatory to take into account. When a qadi, when a judge passes a judgment, it is wajib upon him to look at the urf of the people and then pass his judgment. We know that the fuqaha of the past, before they passed a judgment, they would go to the marketplaces, they would spend time and understand what's going on, then they would give fatwa. Take Imam al-Shafi'i. Imam al-Shafi'i wrote much of his fiqh in Baghdad. When he traveled to Masr, to Egypt, in the latter part of his life, he rewrote much of his fiqh based on the urf, or the culture, conventions, and customs of the people of Egypt. The fuqaha were extremely intelligent. the problem we have today is we reduce our intellectual ability from a usuli perspective, legal theory perspective, and fiqh perspective. We reduce it to something so simple. And simplicity is not indicative of an intelligent design or intelligent mind. It's indicative of a simple mind. Your fiqh is so versatile. It's so phenomenal. It can go so deep and deal with almost everything. Like I said at the beginning, Islam doesn't tell you what to do. Islam draws a circle. You can do what you want in that circle. What you can't do is cross that line. So cultural practices, there's nothing wrong with them, so long as they do not infringe any core aspect of the Sharia. Wallahu a'lam.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's a good summary. And since we're coming to the end of the discussion, just to summarize some of the points. So obviously we mentioned that we've established that, you know, Islam is not at odds with culture. In fact, Islam, you know, embraces it. And there are different, you know, culture can be, or urf can be classified into a good urf, which is accepted, or one that is not. And that would be when a part of that urf contradicts an Islamic teaching. Like we spoke about clothing, or that food might be haram, or that particular type of clothing isn't appropriate, or in marriage, for example, if it goes against an Islamic teaching, etc., right? Then we know that is not acceptable. But then the rest of it, like coming back to our point earlier on, which is, you know, there is actually a lot of flexibility, then the rest of it is actually okay, right? The rest of it is actually fine, unless proven otherwise, unless we prove that it's definitely the Quran or the Sunnah or something, Islam condemns it, the Sharia condemns it, sorry, then we can know for sure. So all of these examples we mentioned, you know, having this pre-wedding thing, this Mehndi, whatever you want to call it, you know, wearing a turban on the wedding day for the groom, wearing these types of shoes, having a wedding cake, or exchanging rings, or, you know, whatever it might be, this is okay. You know, we're not saying again that it's from the Sunnah to do it, that you're going to be like rewarded for doing it, right? We're not saying that either.
We can't say that at all.
Exactly, right? We're not saying it's a religious practice in and of itself. We're saying that this is part of, you know, the general culture, and this is what is generally practiced today. You know, this is something that is not un-Islamic, right? So why not? What's the big deal? It's a nice thing. In fact, you know, I would go as far as to say it's some of those things actually recommended to, with the intention of, you know, giving gifts or bringing the family together, and, you know, celebrating the nikah as you're supposed to do, celebrating the walima as we're supposed to do. But how we celebrate those things, of course, now is to do and would vary from culture to culture. So the way that you know, I've been to nikahs where, mashallah, I've been to like weddings where the bride and groom were Egyptian, right? What they do in their weddings, I'm like, oh, what's going on here, right? Because I'm just not used to it. And then I go to a Somali wedding, right? I go to someone who's from like you know, Eritrea, and what they do in their weddings, I'm like, whoa, okay, that's interesting. You know, the food is different, the clothing's different, even the way that the nikah is done, it's interesting. The nikah, in terms of its, you know, main components, is all there, right? The witnesses are there, the mahar, everything. But, you know, just the way that it's done, you know, some people, the wali holds the hand of the groom. Have you seen this before? But the wali will hold the hand of the groom while the aqd is taking place. Now that's generally not done from where you and I are from, right? That's generally not done. So even in those small things, there are minor differences. That doesn't change, you know, the status in terms of the validity. It just, you know, it's just a way of it being practiced. So, I mean, that's just a quick summary from my end. Since we're coming to the end, is there anything else, Ustadh, that you wanted to add to our discussion to end things off with?
Yeah, no, I think we've had a fairly extensive discussion. Look, I'd like to say that, look, by all means, if you don't feel comfortable, then don't do that. That's fine, right? I mean, you know, this whole thing about دع ما يريبك إلى ما لا يريبك. Leave what is doubtful for that which is not doubtful. Remember, doubtfulness is not in objects. There is no doubt in text or objects. Doubt is what resides in your mind. If you consider this thing to be doubtful, then abandon it. That's fine. But what I'm saying is, before you impose your understanding, because many of us have grown up with a version of Islam. We haven't earned the knowledge for ourselves. We haven't gone out and studied the hadith and the fiqh. We don't understand the texts by ourselves. So we've relied on what people have told us, and we've adopted that as the asal. So there's an encouragement to go and actually study the deen for yourself. The other thing I'd say is, yes, we have to also with equal might say and breadth say that yes, any practice which infringes the hudud of Allah, or any practice which is an intrinsic part of a religious another religious practice, which is often to do with the deification of another deity other than Allah, na'udhu billah, then that has to be condemned.
Yeah.
So I completely agree with that. But at the same time, Islam doesn't give us a culture. Islam and culture is like talking about apples and bananas. There's no sense of contradiction there. If you find a contradiction in culture, then that's not cultural, that's religious of another religion, or it's haram, which has to be rejected.
Yep.
Other than that, you can do what you want, so long as you don't infringe the laws of Allah. Yes, there are some recommendations. There are some beautiful practices that we should adhere to. We should try to come close to what we call sunnah jibiliya, right? Or sunnah zaida, the sunnah which is linked to the personality of the Prophet, what he liked, what he didn't like. Someone to go and encourage that. That's a good thing. And I think for the most part, many of Islamic countries, their culture is very much in line with it. Problem is most people don't have a depth when it comes to studying these things, so they're not exposed to many of these ahadith and many of these discussions. Having said that, look, let us focus on our salawat and our intentions and things that really are changing. And we're coming close to times where holding on to iman is like holding on to hot coal, and we're having the wrong discussions. Well, our focus is on the wrong things here. There's far more deeper things that need to be discussed, things in our society that are damaging our youth and damaging our iman. There's a lot more important things at stake that we need to discuss. Wallahu a'lam, but marriage is a beautiful thing, and we should be concerned about it and give mahar, give lots of gifts. This is part of the sunnah of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam. May Allah bless you. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Jazakallah khair. Jazakallah khair, Ustadh Abu Zuhair, for joining us today from Q Iman. Of course, to our listeners and viewers, do check out qiman.org for any courses. If you're in London, then you can actually attend on-site. And then we have online courses as well. But I hope you all enjoyed. Make sure you check us out on the Nikah Co on social media. And inshallah, we've got lots more podcasts coming your way. But from myself, Shabir, on this occasion, from Ustadh Abu Zuhair, that is all we have time for. We'll see you next time. Take care of yourselves. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.